616 people died in a single London neighborhood in the summer of 1854. Cholera took them in days, sometimes in hours. The medical establishment blamed bad air, miasma rising from the Thames, the very smell of poverty itself. But one physician saw something different. John Snow mapped every death, traced the pattern to a single water pump, and proved contamination was the killer. He removed the pump handle. The death stopped. The evidence was undeniable, and the establishment denied it anyway. For decades, they let people die from a problem already solved. The simple question is why? The summer of 1854 brought death to London with a speed that defied explanation. In the crowded streets of Soho, in a neighborhood called Golden Square, cholera descended like a biblical plague. Within 3 days, 127 people were dead. Within 10 days, more than 500 were dead. By the time the outbreak subsided, 616 residents of a single London parish had perished. The bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. Entire families were found dead in their rooms, struck down within hours of each other. Children who played in the streets at dawn were corpses by nightfall. The medical establishment had an explanation. They always did. Miasma theory dominated 19th century medicine. Disease came from bad air, from the noxious vapors rising from swamps and sewers, from the very smell of decay and poverty. The Thames was an open sewer, and the stench of London in summer was legendary. Cholera, the physicians declared, was airborne. It floated on the fog. It crept through the atmosphere. It settled on the poor because the poor lived closer to the sources of foul air. This explanation was convenient. It required no uncomfortable questions about water supplies controlled by private companies. It demanded no investigation into the infrastructure that served wealthy neighborhoods differently than poor ones. It placed blame on geography and atmosphere, forces beyond human responsibility. The official position was clear. Cholera was a disease of bad air, and the solution was better ventilation. But here's where the pattern breaks. John Snow was not a radical. He was not an outsider. He was a respected London physician, personal anesthetist to Queen Victoria, a man whose credentials placed him firmly within the medical establishment. He had studied cholera during previous outbreaks and noticed something the miasma theory could not explain. The disease attacked the digestive system. It caused violent intestinal symptoms. Patients died of dehydration and fluid loss. If cholera was inhaled through the lungs, why did it manifest exclusively in the gut? Snow had proposed a waterborne theory as early as 1849. The establishment dismissed it, not because they examined his evidence and found it wanting. They dismissed it because it contradicted the consensus. Because questioning miasma meant questioning the entire framework of Victorian public health. Then came the Broad Street outbreak. Snow lived near Golden Square. He watched the death toll climb and saw something the miasma theorists refused to see. The deaths were not distributed evenly, the way airborne disease should spread. They were clustered, concentrated, radiating outward from a specific location in a pattern that looked less like atmospheric diffusion and more like contamination from a single source. He began mapping. Death by death, address by address, Snow plotted the cholera cases on a street map of Soho. Dot after dot appeared on the paper, each one representing a family destroyed, a household emptied. The pattern that emerged was impossible to ignore. The deaths clustered densely around one specific location, a water pump, the Broad Street pump to be precise, situated at the intersection where Cambridge Street met Broad Street. The closer a household was to that pump, the higher its mortality rate. Move a few blocks away and the deaths dropped dramatically. The pump stood at the exact epicenter of the epidemic, but Snow found something else. Anomalies that the miasma theory could not touch. There was a workhouse on Poland Street, practically surrounded by cholera deaths. 535 inmates lived there. Only 5 died. Why would an airborne disease spare a crowded institution while devastating the houses around it? The workhouse had its own private water supply. Its residents never used the Broad Street pump. There was a brewery on Broad Street itself, directly adjacent to the worst affected area. Not a single brewery worker contracted cholera. Snow investigated and found the explanation. The brewery provided its workers with free beer. They had no reason to drink water at all, and the brewery, like the workhouse, had its own well. The math does not just break, it shatters. If miasma was the cause, proximity to the Thames should have predicted mortality. It did not. If bad air was the culprit, the brewery workers and workhouse inmates should have died at the same rates as their neighbors. They did not. If atmospheric conditions spread the disease, the clustering around a single pump made no sense whatsoever, unless the source was not the AR, unless something else was happening. Snow compiled his evidence. The map, with its damning cluster of deaths, the statistical analysis showing correlation between pump usage and mortality. The anomalies that proved water was the transmission vector. He brought his findings to the Board of Guardians of St. James's Parish on September 7th, and he made a simple request: remove the pump handle. The Board of Guardians listened to Snow's presentation. They examined his map. They heard his statistical analysis, his explanation of the workhouse anomaly, his account of the brewery workers who drank beer instead of water and lived while their neighbors died. The evidence was laid before them in meticulous detail. And then something remarkable happened. They agreed. On September 8, 1854, the handle of the Broad Street pump was removed. The residents of Golden Square could no longer draw water from that source. Within days, the outbreak collapsed. New cases dropped to nearly zero. The epidemic that had killed hundreds in a matter of weeks simply stopped. This should have been the moment of triumph. The experiment had worked. The hypothesis had been tested and confirmed in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. A physician had predicted that removing access to contaminated water would end a cholera outbreak, and that is exactly what occurred. In any rational framework, this would have launched an immediate investigation into water contamination across London. It would have transformed public health policy overnight. That is not what happened. The Board of Guardians, who had authorized the pump handle's removal, did not credit Snow's waterborne theory. They stated that they had acted out of an abundance of caution, not because they believed his analysis. The outbreak, they suggested, had probably been ending anyway. The timing was coincidental. The pump handle removal was a precaution, nothing more. But the deeper rejection came later. The General Board of Health launched its own investigation into the Broad Street outbreak. They interviewed witnesses, they examined the evidence, they reviewed Snow's map and his statistical methodology. Their final report, published in 1855, acknowledged Snow's work in passing. Then they dismissed it entirely. The report concluded that the outbreak had been caused by miasmatic conditions, bad air from the sewers, atmospheric corruption from the overcrowded streets. The water theory was mentioned only to be rejected. The board found no compelling evidence that contaminated water had caused the epidemic. The clustering around the Broad Street pump was attributed to other factors. The coincidence of the pump handle removal and the outbreak's end was exactly that. It was a coincidence. Consider what this means. A physician had mapped an epidemic with unprecedented precision. He had identified a contamination source. He had predicted the outcome of an intervention. The intervention had worked exactly as predicted, and the official response was not curiosity, not investigation, not even skepticism seeking further evidence. The official response was flat denial. The miasma theory remained the dominant paradigm. Textbooks continued teaching that cholera was airborne. Public health officials continued focusing on ventilation and atmospheric conditions. The private water companies that supplied London's neighborhoods faced no investigation, no accountability, no pressure to examine their sources. Why would they reject evidence that could save lives? Here is where something else becomes visible. The miasma theory was not just a medical hypothesis, it was the foundation of an entire infrastructure. City planning decisions, Sewage contracts, water company regulations, property values in different neighborhoods all rested on the assumption that bad air, not contaminated water, caused epidemic disease. The wealthy lived on higher ground with better ventilation. The poor lived in low-lying areas with worse air. This was not coincidence, but design. It was the natural order of things. If snow was right, that entire framework collapsed. If water was the vector, then the private companies supplying that water were complicit in mass death. If contamination came through pipes and pumps, then the infrastructure itself was the killer. If a simple map could identify the source of an epidemic, then responsibility could be assigned. Blame could be placed. Lawsuits could be filed. The establishment maintained its position. Snow continued his research. He published his findings in expanded form. He traced other outbreaks to other water sources. He built a body of evidence so comprehensive that any honest observer should have found it overwhelming. The honest observers were not the ones making policy. Snow's methodology was attacked. His conclusions were questioned. His insistence on the waterborne theory was treated as an eccentricity, a hobby horse, an obsession that marked him as somehow unreliable despite his otherwise stellar reputation. The very precision of his work became evidence of his imbalance. A reasonable man would have accepted the consensus. A reasonable man would have acknowledged uncertainty. Only a fanatic would keep insisting on a theory the authorities had already rejected. The pattern is familiar, not violence, not censorship, just professional marginalization, institutional forgetting, the quiet burial of inconvenient evidence beneath the weight of official consensus. John Snow died on June 16, 1858. He was 45 years old. A stroke took him, sudden and swift, and he passed from the world without ever seeing his theory accepted. The medical establishment that had dismissed his work continued dismissing it. The textbooks that taught miasma theory continued teaching it. The water companies that had poisoned London's poor continued operating without oversight or accountability. He died knowing he was right. He died knowing they knew he was right. He died knowing it did not matter. The human cost of that denial is almost impossible to calculate. Cholera continued ravaging European cities for decades after Snow's death. The disease he had explained, the transmission vector he had identified, the intervention he had proven effective, all of it remained officially rejected, while thousands more died from contaminated water supplies that could have been cleaned, from pumps that could have been closed, from sources that could have been traced using the very methodology Snow had pioneered. How many deaths between 1858 and the eventual acceptance of germ theory? How many epidemics that could have been prevented? How many families destroyed by a disease that one physician had already solved? The numbers are staggering. London alone suffered multiple cholera outbreaks after Snow's death. The 1866 epidemic killed over 5,000 people in the East End, traced eventually to contaminated water from the old Ford Reservoir, the same pattern Snow had identified, the same clustering around water sources, the same evidence that should have been obvious to anyone who bothered to look at a map. But maps require looking, and looking requires willingness to see. The vindication came too late to matter. In 1866, William Farr, the same statistician who had initially dismissed Snow's work, finally acknowledged that the waterborne theory explained the East End outbreak. Germ theory gained acceptance in the 1870s and the 1880s. By the end of the century, Snow was being quietly rehabilitated, his methodology recognized as foundational to modern epidemiology. Today, he is celebrated. The John Snow Society meets annually at a pub near the site of the old Broad Street pump. Medical schools teach his case study as a triumph of empirical reasoning. His map hangs in public health departments around the world, iconic evidence of how careful observation can reveal hidden patterns of causation. But the celebration obscures the lesson. Snow wasn't vindicated because the establishment changed its mind. He was vindicated because the establishment eventually died, and was replaced by people who hadn't built their careers on miasma theory. The paradigm didn't shift, it was outlived. The men who rejected Snow's evidence went to their graves still rejecting it. They never admitted they were wrong. They never acknowledged the deaths their stubbornness caused. They simply ceased to matter. This is the template. This is what the Broad Street Pump reveals about how truth moves through institutions. Evidence is not enough. Proof is not enough. Demonstration, prediction, successful intervention. None of it is enough when the truth threatens the infrastructure that powerful people have built their authority upon. The rejection isn't about science. It's never about science. It's about what happens to careers and contracts and property values and carefully maintained hierarchies of expertise when an outsider with a map proves the insiders wrong. How many other Jon Snows have there been? How many maps ignored? How many patterns suppressed not because the evidence was weak, but because the implications were unacceptable? The question isn't really about cholera anymore. The Broad Street Pump still stands. A replica, at least, was installed in 1992 near the original location. The handle is removable. A small monument to a physician who saw what others refused to see, who mapped what others refused to acknowledge, who died before the world admitted he had been right all along. 616 people died in the summer of 1854. Their deaths were explained. Their killer was identified. The solution was demonstrated. And for decades, the authorities looked at the evidence and chose to look away. Not because they couldn't see the pattern, because seeing it would have cost them something they weren't willing to pay. The map still exists. You can look at it today. The dots still cluster around that pump on Broad Street, each one a death that didn't have to happen, a family that didn't have to grieve, a truth that didn't have to wait. They knew, they always knew, and they let it continue anyway.